Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we look at two government agencies in the news, the National Labor Relations Board and the Federal Reserve. In the second half of our show, we'll talk to David Stockman, former director of the Office of Management and Budget under Ronald Reagan, who's become a prolific Wall Street scold and inveterate blogger. Up first, Iain Murray, Vice President of Strategy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, examines the impact of evolving labor regulations. Iain, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you today, Bill.
Iain, you and your team follow the work of the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB, quite closely. Recent rulings are roiling the world of franchising and subcontracting. But before we get into that, give us a little background. When and why was the NLRB created, and what are its powers?
Well, that's actually a very complicated story, and it really all goes back to the 1920s and 1930s. And what was happening then, and what the sort of prevailing opinion was about what created prosperity. When you look at the history of the 1920s, when unions were really starting to flex their muscles.
Very powerful.
They've been around for a bit, since the American Federation of Labor was founded in the 1870s, but they hadn't really sort of broken through into the mainstream. But then in the 1920s, there came about a sort of prevailing opinion that what really led to American prosperity was high wages. And this was actually on both sides of the aisle. The unions obviously strongly believed it,
sure,
but so did people like Henry Ford and Thomas Edison and, the great American innovators of the time. They believed strongly that paying high wages led to American prosperity. And this filtered through into the political sphere, and Herbert Hoover, the Republican president, was a very strong proponent of the high wage doctrine. So when it came to the Great Depression, and obviously Hoover was blamed for that and Roosevelt was elected, there was still a sort of remarkable unanimity on both sides of the aisle that high wages were absolutely necessary, and that therefore
unionization
what America needed was to get rid of these recalcitrant employers that weren't offering high wages and force them into collective bargaining agreements with unions that would guarantee high wages. And so initially, the very first National Labor Relations Board was set up under the auspices of the New Deal's National Industrial Recovery Act, which was a fundamental part of Roosevelt's New Deal, but was eventually found unconstitutional.
Much of Roosevelt's earlier experiments were ruled unconstitutional, so not everything survived.
No. And in fact, the NIRA was, very much the flagship of the New Deal. And so when that was found unconstitutional, that was a huge blow. But they resurrected the National Labor Relations Board part of it and put that into something called the Wagner Act or the National Labor Relations Act. The two titles are basically interchangeable. And most people actually expected that to be ruled unconstitutional as well. But it wasn't. So as a result, the National Labor Relations Act has basically governed all American labor relations since that date.
Now, what are the actual powers of the NLRB?
Well, the powers of the NLRB today are to basically adjudicate on claims of unfair labor practices. Now, this is quite wide-ranging. It basically means if an employer's sort of refusing to deal with a union, if they're trying to interfere with employees, trying to organize a union, trying to organize an election, discriminating against an employee because of their attempts to set up a union, and discriminating against an employee for filing a complaint with the National Labor Relations Board. There are also some restrictions on the unions as well. They're not allowed to engage in certain boycotts and picketing or using the collective bargaining agreement to institute what's known as feather bedding, far more employees than is needed.
And this is all part of what's called the administrative law court system, separate from the rest of the law courts.
Yes, that's very much the case. If a complaint is made to the NLRB, the regional director looks at it first and decides if further action is warranted, and then it goes to the administrative law judge, and then it can be appealed from the administrative law judge to the National Labor Relations Board. National Labor Relations Board cannot actually enforce its decisions. It has to apply to a court to enforce it if there's no immediate action by both parties. Only once the NLRB has ruled can employer or the union then appeal to the Article 3 court. So it means that if you're engaged in some complaint of unfair labor practices, getting your case heard by the actual Article 3 court can take many years.
So, Ian, thanks for that background. What is this new joint employer ruling recently issued by a 3-2 partisan majority of the NLRB, and why does it have so many people worried?
One of the complexities of current American labor law is that sometimes you will have somebody who is technically employed by one employer, but who actually reports for duties at the offices or factory or whatever of another employer. So, for instance, if you work in an office, the chances are that the people who come around and vacuum your office floor and empty your trash cans and so on at night, they're actually probably employed not by your firm or by the building, but by another firm that is contracted with the building or your firm.
Well, staffing agencies that provide non-essential services have been a big growth part of the economy, haven't they?
Absolutely. This sort of outsourcing and staffing supplies, depending on how you define it, is basically between 5 and 10% of all employment practices in the United States. This has grown considerably over the past 4 decades.
So how many businesses and employees are potentially impacted by this ruling?
Well, it looks like there are something like 770,000 businesses that could be affected by this ruling.
Wow.
And that number's growing all the time. The gig economy, as Hillary Clinton calls it, the sharing economy, as most people call it, that very much depends on this idea that people are put in touch with other people who want to employ their services by somebody who could be regarded as their employer. Is Uber the employer of the Uber drivers? That's a very good question, and that's one that's come up in California state law.
So what does this specific ruling say?
Well, what the National Labor Relations Board has done is reverse about 40 years of precedent. Basically, in the 1970s, the board started on a track which basically said that the secondary employer in these cases, the office building, for instance, for the cleaners in that example, they had to exercise some sort of direct and immediate control over how the employees were actually employed, their wage rates, their hours, and so on. And so for the most part, joint employers, the office buildings, didn't actually exercise this direct and immediate control. They left that all up to the staffing company. This, of course, made it very difficult for unions to unionize the secondary employer. So the Teamsters Union had a case with Browning Ferris Industries, which is a recycling plant that has a lot of shift workers that it hires from a staffing company called Lead Point. And the National Labor Relations Board said, the regional director said, and the National Labor Relations Board itself agreed, basically, that yes, Browning Ferris was not a joint employer under the last 40 years worth of rulings and precedent. But that wasn't good enough. They were going to change that. They were going to change the rules so that just having the potential to exercise control would be enough to count as a joint employer, so the Teamsters could go ahead and unionize Browning Ferris Industries if they were able to win an election.
So this opens up a whole new front in unionization.
Very much so. In fact, the NLRB decision itself is quite explicit that what they're all about is trying to increase the amount of collective bargaining in America, and they say that they have statutory authority for this under the National Labor Relations Act.
So, Ian, this new National Labor Relations Board ruling affects not only staffing agencies, but also franchises, big franchises like McDonald's. How have they been reacting?
Well, actually, this National Labor Relations Board ruling doesn't actually affect franchises, but it's a big signal that a forthcoming case that the NLRB has to decide, which involves McDonald's itself, will actually change the precedence for franchise firms as well as for staffing companies. It would be a huge surprise if they didn't. So franchisees are already extremely worried about this. What this ruling would mean, if applied in cases like McDonald's, would mean that the corporate firm of McDonald's, which only operates about 10% of all the restaurants in the United States, and 90% of them are franchises, the corporate parent could be very easily unionized through a franchisee, or vice versa. So this makes things extremely difficult for franchise companies. What they are more likely to do, rather than just run the risk of being unionized through franchise companies, is just exercise much more central control over the franchisees. In fact, most franchisees are worried that this will be to the extent that they will cease to be the entrepreneurs that they are currently, and that they will become, rather than business owners, just middle managers in a much bigger corporate structure. And this does seem to be the NLRB's aim. It does seem to be that they want to re-corporatize America and move it away from the franchise model that has been so successful.
This also sounds like a great boon for the trial lawyers, because now if a local independent McDonald's franchise is fighting a wrongful dismissal suit, McDonald's Corporation can be dragged in as a defendant.
No, that's very much the case. And that's just one of the reasons why corporate headquarters are getting very worried about this and thinking that, they're going to have to exercise much more control over their franchisees.
Under the old rules, picketing and secondary boycotts of, for example, parent organizations were illegal. If this changes, are we going to start seeing nationwide picketing at McDonald's headquarters?
That's certainly the case. In fact, one of the reforms to the National Labor Relations Act, the Taft-Hartley Act, was meant to try and cut down on the amount of secondary picketing that went on. But it's quite clear that this ruling will actually enable unions to picket other franchises, to engage in boycotts, things that
used to be
were
illegal.
Ruled out of order by Congress in the 1940s. They realized how bad they were. But they're going to come back, it looks like.
Union violence has always been part of the labor movement. And while we don't see incidents anywhere as deadly as, the Homestead strike back in the 1890s, tire slashing and intimidation of picket line crossers is still pretty common. If this NLRB ruling stands and is extended to franchises, would you predict an uptick in violence?
Well, there have been over 12,000 incidents of union violence in the United States since 1975. That's not insignificant. And the unions are actually sort of excluded from a lot of prosecution under things like the Federal Extortion Act, the Hobbs Act. So it is quite possible that unions will use those loopholes that they have and the new freedom to engage in what the General Counsel calls, of the NLRB calls traditional economic pressure, which to you and me means picketing and boycotts and intimidation. They're going to use those on franchises around the country and staffing firms around the country. I think that's quite clear.
Reading up on this, it seems that one of the tactics is to go after a parent company and get a labor peace agreement. What is that?
Essentially, a labor peace agreement is when the employer essentially surrenders and says, okay, we're going to waive all our rights. You can have things like card check and other union-favored activities which make the operating unit much easier to organize, much easier for them to get an election through, at which point they have all the benefits of the National Labor Relations Act protections. And this is the most important point. By becoming the exclusive bargaining unit for that operation, they then get to take dues out of the wage packets of every single worker there, whether they want the union or not. And that's the most important objective of unions these days, it seems.
So you mentioned card check. Wasn't there an attempt by unions to get rid of secret ballot elections and get Congress to pass a law allowing them to use card check to gain representation? What happened to that?
Well, yes, this was the Orwellian-named Employee Free Choice Act. They attempted to get that through during that brief period of Democratic control of both the legislature and the executive back after President Obama was first elected. They'd found that in secret ballots, unions lost far more elections than they did under the old card check system, whereby you just go and collect a card from somebody saying, yes, I'd like the union to represent me. And of course, card check is much more susceptible to tactics like intimidation than the secret ballot. That's why we have the secret ballot in all our other elections. But unions didn't like that, so they were trying to get this through Congress. But even that Congress that got through Obamacare and the Dodd-Frank Act couldn't get through the Employee Free Choice Act. It was just a step too far. So they're trying to do what the Employee Free Choice Act did. If they can't get it through the legislature, they're trying to get it through the administrative regulatory system. So the NLRB is issuing all sorts of rulings that are compatible with what EFCA was supposed to present.
Will these new NLRB rulings have a different impact in right-to-work states compared to forced unionization states?
As always, there's a difference between right-to-work and forced unionization states. In right-to-work states, you can't be forced to join a union. So, yes, it will mean the difference between right-to-work states and the forced unionization states will become even wider. And so franchising and staffing companies will probably try and relocate as much as they can to right-to-work states, which is what we've seen with manufacturing and others over the past 20 or 30 years. This will just widen the divide even more.
Could this encourage more states to pass right-to-work legislation?
So it's definitely a pressure. I mean, we've seen that even some of the most die-hard union states like Michigan. Michigan is the state that CEI found had suffered the most over the years from the imposition of collective bargaining. Michigan passed right to work not so long ago. While there are pressures like this in play, I think those states which are sort of teetering on the brink may well consider right to work as a way to reintroduce some prosperity back into the state. Yes, it could definitely be a pressure that way, along with all the other pressures that you see from the difference between right to work and forced unionization states.
One of the biggest innovations in urban transportation in decades has been the emergence of companies like Uber and Lyft, challenging the entrenched taxi cartels. One of the keys to their success and scalability has been the use of flexible independent contractors as drivers rather than employees. Labor activists have been fighting back, trying to get Uber to make their drivers employees. What role does the NLRB play in this battle?
Well, at the moment, that battle is tending to be fought at the state level. In California, there is, I believe, a new law that says that Uber contractors are actually employees. And of course, as soon as you designate somebody an employee rather than a contractor, then the employee loses an awful lot of freedoms, and the employer gains an awful lot of responsibilities. So the very basis of the gig economy, which is lower transaction costs for the employer or facilitator, perhaps is a better word, and a huge amount of flexibility for their work schedules for the contractor, those disappear. And the unique selling proposition of these sharing economy industries, that just disappears overnight.
So I take Uber all the time, and every time I get in the car, I ask the driver, how do you like driving for Uber? And the first thing they mention every time is the flexibility. They drive when they want, they don't drive when they don't want, they get called out when there's surge pricing in effect, and they don't seem to be willing to trade that for anything.
Well, that's very much the case. I mean, flexibility is one of the most important factors in people deciding what job to take these days. I believe that work-life balance and flexibility always comes up at the top of any survey, quite often above pay, and the traditional things that the labor unions are out there championing. We're also seeing something very similar to this in the administration's new proposed overtime rules, which will basically eliminate flexibility for a huge swathe of workers who are now going to be forced to clock their hours and do all the sort of things that you associate with a factory floor from the 1940s rather than the flexible economy of the 2010s. It's a real step back in time.
Well, this will mostly affect first-line managers trying to climb the ranks up into senior management positions.
That's exactly the case. If you're trying to show how aspirational you are, but by voluntarily working extra hours, taking on extra responsibilities beyond what you're designated for, that becomes very difficult for the employer to grant under these new overtime laws. So it's all part and parcel of this attempt to turn the clock back 40 years.
So, Iain, what are the politics of all this? I mean, 13 of the top 25 all-time campaign contributors are labor unions, and most of that money goes to Democrats.
Well, that's very much the case. And there was an article in the New York Times just this morning that celebrates the fact that the president is actually deliberately paying back his union backers. And it seems to be quite clear that both the unions and the president want to turn the clock back 40 years. Obviously, anybody who doesn't want to see the clock turn back 40 years on employment practices is being sold down the river by their party. If for instance, they're a Democrat who really enjoys working in the sharing economy, there are basically anybody in Silicon Valley knows how important flexible working arrangements are to their industry. but they're being forced into this model.
One size fits all.
From the 1940s, this factory employment model from the 1940s. So I think we could see a real reaction once this starts to bite from traditional supporters of the Democratic Party. And it'll be interesting to see what they do.
Well, Iain, thanks for bringing us up to date. We're certainly going to keep an eye on this. I expect this battle is going to go on for some time.
It's been a pleasure.
That was Iain Murray from CEI here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. Please stop by RealClearRadio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Ahead, we'll get some straight talk from David Stockman, former director of the Office of Management and Budget under Ronald Reagan, never shy about shaming Wall Street and its Washington insiders. Stay tuned.